Okay. Dan?
Thank you. This is an issue I've been, again, talking about from the beginning. I noted at the very beginning of my campaign that during our last gubernatorial election, Lieutenant Governor Healy and now Governor Patrick both agreed that giving cities and towns the option to join the Group Insurance Commission to buy their insurance through the same pool the state uses, so more people, bigger pool, lower rates, would save hundreds of millions of dollars. And both candidates said that if they were elected, that would be a priority. The problem is, and I disagree that we have to go on a fact-finding mission to find out why cities and towns aren't joining the GIC. Governor Patrick did file that legislation, but someone got in his ear, and he added a little wrinkle. I was actually involved in the crafting of that legislation. It was crafted during the Romney-Healy administration, and Lieutenant Governor Healy was a driving force behind it. So I'm quite familiar with it. And there was a little kicker added in the process before it was filed by Governor Patrick, which gives municipal unions an absolute veto over a town's decision to join the GIC. Now that's a huge hurdle. That's an absolute veto. My opponent has been a little bit back and forth on this one through the course of this campaign. She initially said, when this was brought up, that we need to respect the bargaining rights of the unions, which of course is true insofar as it doesn't violate law, and if the law had been passed, the law would have been what the law was. And then she said later that we needed to consider changing the law to allow cities and towns to join without union buy-in. And then toward the end of the primary, she suggested that if that did not work out and more cities and towns didn't join, we should consider mandating it. All cities and towns wouldn't benefit from this. It should be a local decision. It shouldn't be a mandate. But some cities and towns absolutely, and there shouldn't be a union veto over that decision if it's best for the city or the town's finances.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
All right. Regionalization.
It's a long monitor.
Oh, it is good. In Massachusetts, local home rule remains strong, but the current fiscal situation provides an opportunity for towns to join together to provide services on a regional basis to achieve savings. Do you agree with that statement? And if so, what specific steps or incentives would you endorse to encourage greater regionalization or services among cities and towns?
Dan. I got it wrong, so we got to get it back right.
All right. Dan, go for it.
Well, absolutely. This is one of those common sense things that says, people, again, who operate in the real world, and if you present them with the following proposition, entity X and entity Y are right next door, and they duplicate services, and they could consolidate services, and it would cost both of them less without a drop-off in service. Most people would shrug and say, well, what's the problem? We ought to, at the state level, to answer your question. Again, I'll go back to incentives. Cities and towns ought to have a reason to do this, whether it be increased local aid, whether it be a break from other requirements imposed by the state. We ought to be giving incentives to cities and towns to identify and implement opportunities for consolidation of services where it makes sense. The example that's always used on Beacon Hill is cities and towns, most of them have a trench inspector, and certainly every city and town doesn't need a trench inspector. We ought to give cities and towns the incentive to regionalize services where that makes sense. And again, it shouldn't be a mandate, because I believe very strongly in the notion that we are a home rule state, and people at the local level know best how they ought to be spending their money. But it's certainly something that should be encouraged.
Thank you. Carolyn.
Dan and I agree on this, and I've been saying this from the very beginning, that we absolutely have to do this. And incentives work. I think, it's extremely difficult, as I've mentioned earlier. It's tough to get things moving in the public sector, and it takes a tremendous amount of effort. And from local officials that I've talked to that have tried to actually implement some of these regional agreements. It's incredibly difficult, takes a long time. There needs to be a reason at the end of the day, a real incentive for them to take that on and make that happen. And I think whatever we can do in the way of financial incentives tied to local aid, I think is a great idea. I think other offering flexibility in other areas that would be a benefit to towns, that's a great idea. It's a reason for public officials to go the extra mile to make this happen. Short-term, pay a little more or invest a little more time up front for the short term for a long-term gain of regionalizing services.
Just a quick follow, just to get a little more meat in this. Other than trench inspector, which is an unfunded state mandate, and every town now has to have a trench inspector, but obviously not a full-time position. There are other similar things probably, but from both of you, what suggestions for either positions or types of things? I mean, I've heard even school systems regionalizing. That might be a little bit much, but give some examples of ways in which to regionalize, please. Dan first. Well,
we live very near to Dover-Sherburne, which regionalized its schools. That's a doable thing, but I don't think that's something that right off the cuff is something that the towns in our district would want to look at. But there was just an article in your paper, Jim, this week about how Hopkinton and Milford share emergency response responsibilities in the fire department, and they train together, which also, by the way, is a cost savings. That's one area. Training in any number, police training, fire training, emergency response training, even some of the curriculum for teachers. We ought to find ways where things that aren't core services that people ought to have a much longer process to decide to regionalize. Something like a school system. That's something that people feel very passionately about at the local level, and they should. That's not something that you want to just suggest off the cuff. But some of these things that are not core service but related to core service, like training programs.
Any more?
I would think that, there's sort of differing levels of regionalization, and that's, what Dan's talking about is sort of the low-hanging fruit. And I think towns have been trying to do that for quite a while now, wherever it's sort of you can easily combine training and things like that. I think a lot of that has been done, or certainly steps have been made. I think the real gains, and we need to see some real gains, quite frankly, when we're looking at our budgets these days, is in construction costs. And I think the state, funds some of these construction projects. And I think whenever a construction project is being undertaken, I think there should be incentives given to towns that they should step back and say, hey, wait a minute, do we need our own, whatever it is, DPW building? Is this the kind of thing that we can share with another town and take a serious look at that? And if towns can work that out and come to an agreement, there will be some financial incentive at the end of the road. I think that's real progress toward regionalization, and I think that's where we're going to see the real savings in construction as opposed to just combining services. That said, I think there's also an opportunity for purchasing. I think clearly, our towns purchase services on a local level. And it should come as no surprise that when you purchase in greater bulk, you get a better deal. And one of the things that's come out in talking with a local selectman is the Munis software program that all towns need to submit data to the state. Apparently, each town has to purchase its own license agreement from Munis at standard costs in order to be able to do that. Why can't we, bulk purchase those licensing agreements and give the towns the savings?